الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
الحمد لله الذي وحده على ومجده واسأل عونه وتوسلا. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. الحمد لله الذي خلق فسوى. الحمد لله الذي قدر فهدى. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أيها المؤمنون اتقوا الله، فإن ربكم يقول في القرآن العظيم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم إن زلزلة الساعة شيء عظيم. يوم ترونها تذهل كل مرضعة عما أرضعت وتضع كل ذات حمل حملها وترى الناس سكارى وما هم بسكارى ولكن عذاب الله شديد. وبعد أيها المؤمنون، أفضل وأحسن وأتقن الحديث كتاب الله، وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة ليست في شرع الله بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة. وبعد, dear brothers and sisters in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran in Surah Al-Hijr, the chapter of Al-Hijr, He says, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. Verily it is we who have set down the remembrance, and verily it is we who will preserve it. The remembrance here, there are two opinions for the scholars. Just to clarify from the beginning, most scholars say the remembrance here is the Quran. There's an opinion for Ibn Hazm and a narration for Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal that the remembrance here is the Quran and the Sunnah, the entire Sunnah. Any acceptable hadith is considered remembrance. And we're going to talk about that, inshallah. So for the remainder of the khutbah, I'm going to speak about the remembrance as the Quran and the Sunnah. And I don't follow the opinion that says it's only the Quran. Although most scholars follow it, I find that the other opinion has more preponderance. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us in this ayah, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ. We sent down the remembrance. It's from us, and we will preserve this remembrance. And sometimes as Muslims, you don't realize how great that word is. Just preserving something. This blessing of preservation. We don't realize it, and we don't realize how spoiled we are to have such a system that is so preserved from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Something protected and something preserved, something we live by, a system that we live by day in and day out, without really thinking about how much other religions aren't preserved and how badly other people would love to have a system of preservation like that of Islam. I was reading a book called Misquoting Jesus the other day. I didn't get through it all, but I read a good portion of it. I was given this book by a brother from Hassan, Brother Ziad. Told me to read it. He said I had to know some things from that book. And I didn't realize, I knew other religions weren't preserved the same way, but I didn't know that it was that the preservation process was that bad. So I was reading about Christianity and how they preserved their religion. And generally speaking, compared to, if you were to define the word preservation, that wouldn't meet their way of preservation wouldn't meet the definition, the proper definition of preservation. It's more, the Bible is more like a compilation of prophetic traditions. That's fine, but where do they come from? No, you cannot find consensus among the Christian scholars to say that we know exactly where every word came from. We know exactly who the author of every book is in the Bible. You will not find consensus upon this, for sure. But that's not what's important to them. What's important is what's in there and what they get from it. But we're speaking about preservation now and the importance of preservation. So you won't find consensus upon that. And you won't find in any other religion a system of preservation that we have. So how did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve the Quran and the Sunnah for us? When I say preservation, how did this happen? Number one, by making us love it. The Quran and the Sunnah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and through the Quran itself, He encourages us, and he helps the loving process. Number one, He made it easy to memorize. وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. And we have certainly made the Quran easy for remembrance. So is there anyone who remembers? So first of all, Allah made it easy to remember in the first place. Even the Sunnah, if you look at the Sunnah, most of the hadith, most of the prophetic traditions are very short. But the wisdom is very, very large, and the information that you can deduce from those hadith are very large. The information is very large. You can take many rulings and wisdoms from those small hadith, but the hikmah behind the shortness so that we can memorize them, we can apply them and live with them. So the Quran and the Sunnah, from the preservation, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made us love it through this ease of remembrance and memorization. Number two, it's relatively easy to read. The Quran and the Sunnah, yes, it's very eloquent, it's very high-level Arabic, but if you were to try and you were to learn, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bless that. And it'll make it easy upon you. At the beginning it may be difficult, but still it's relatively easy for all that you're reading, history of the past, and you have the past, the present, and the future, and you have rulings, and you have all these different things in the Quran. So it's relatively easy for what you're being offered from the Quran. Also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet says, in regards to the one who tries to read the Quran, here Allah also He's encouraging us to read the Quran, and He's putting that love into our hearts by encouraging us by saying, the one who reads the Quran, الماهر بالقرآن مع السفرة الكرام البررة والذي يقرأ القرآن وهو يتعتع فيه وهو عليه شاق فله أجران. The mahir بالقرآن, the one who reads the Quran with precision, مع السفرة الكرام البررة, he is with the messengers, the messengers from the angels, the ones who hold the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is comparing this person who reads with precision to the angels who hold the Quran. They move it from place to place. The angels of revelation. And then he says, the one who reads the Quran and it's difficult, it's difficult, he's tripping upon it, and it's difficult upon him, له أجران. He gets rewarded twice for that effort. So here again, the Prophet is encouraging us, and he's trying to plant that love of the Quran. And this love, if you think about it, it preserves. Because if you don't love something, you won't do it consistently, and you'll leave it, and then it's not preserved. Also, the Prophet ﷺ, this is one of the most beautiful things I've seen. We were commanded to recite in a melodious way. We were commanded to recite the Quran in a melodious fashion. And this also helps preservation. The Prophet ﷺ says, لَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ لَمْ يَتَغَنَّ بِالْقُرْآنِ. He is not from us. he who recites the Quran, he who does not sing with the Quran, he who does not recite in a melodious fashion. Why? If you imagine reading the Quran like a newspaper, imagine if we were praying right now and I was reading the Quran like a book. No one would feel it, and we wouldn't glorify it as much. You wouldn't feel the beauty of it, even though the beauty is still there. But the Prophet ﷺ knew that the human being, the material part of that human being, needs something melodious to attach him to these things, because we're not, only spiritual beings. We need something to attach us to these spiritual things. The Quran is very heavy. It's very great, so we can't just jump into it right away. So we need things to attach us to it. So one of those things is to read in melodious fashion. Number two, one of the ways Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserved the remembrance of the Quran and the Sunnah. At the beginning of his prophet, the Prophet Muhammad, he advised against the writing of a hadith. People tend to misunderstand this advice and these narrations, because later on there was advice. There are narrations that completely that make it completely permissible to write that hadith. But at the beginning of the prophethood, the Quran was coming down, and the Prophet ﷺ wanted to make sure of two things. He wanted to make sure that people weren't writing a hadith or prophetic traditions with the Quran. Number two, he wanted to make sure people didn't spend too much time away from the Quran, because then it wouldn't have been preserved the way it was. So he advised them against this at the beginning, so they get attached to the Quran. They can know that there's a clear difference between the Quran and the Sunnah. The Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, lafzan wa ma'nan, the word and the meaning. The hadith are revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the meanings, or the meanings are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the words are from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there's a difference. And this is what happened in the previous religion. They would mix the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with their words. Even some of the Sahaba, they had their own personal masahif, their own personal Qur'ans that they used to use for personal use, and they had tafasir under the words or on the side, or the hawamish on the sides, or the borders. They used to write their own tafasir. This was their personal masahif. And they made sure, when they were compiling the Quran and putting together that final Quran, they made sure that they didn't take from their personal masahif, so that there wouldn't be any mixing up of the tafasir or the commentaries. So that's something. Then later on, when people, that love grew and people could differentiate properly between the Quran and the Sunnah. The Quran is up here, and the Sunnah is also up here, but it's not the same level. They're two different sources. Then he allowed it, and then you find narrations later on in his Prophet ﷺ, where he allowed, and people asked him, and he allowed them to write. And even in the beginning, people did write, so it wasn't a complete prohibition. It was just, it was kind of advice against it, so it wouldn't be widespread, and everybody got too busy with the hadith. Number three, it was revealed, the Quran was revealed to a people of memory. Okay, so people say that, the Arab at that time were not literate. Most Arab were not literate. People before that time, before the Arab, most of them were not literate. And a long time after the Arab, they were not literate. That's not the quality that we're looking for here. The quality is they were people of memory. They used to memorize, and they used to put together poetry, and they were known for their skill of memorization. Okay, so it wasn't the illiterate part, because being illiterate doesn't mean you have great memory. So it was revealed to a people with this great memory. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there was wisdom behind this. He wants to show us that this is how important it is to preserve the text. We sent this down to a people who not only can they not make something like this, but there are people who can preserve it also for the people to come. After the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the lies spread about him, the ahadith al-mawdu'a, after he passed away, sallallahu, people left Islam, the murtaddeen, as known for those of you who read the seerah. Soon after he passed away, many people left Islam, and then different sects started forming, and people were lying upon the Prophet sallallahu, so that they could support. They were making a hadith that support their new sects. So this continued, and the only way for the scholars to preserve these ahadith was to bring about a system, or make a system of preservation that can keep these ahadith intact. This is where the science of the hadith came, hadith terminology, or mustalah hadith. This is where the science came from. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you look at what they wrote and how many volumes they put together specifically for this system of preservation, just for the hadith, they have volumes and books called Jarh al-Ta'dil, books criticizing human beings. That's all they. That's the main purpose of the book. It criticizes narrators. Volumes of books criticizing specific narrators. He was born at this time, and he started narrating a hadith at this time, and he narrated from these people, and at this time he knew this many hadith, and at this time he started forgetting. So anytime before he started forgetting, we'll take his narrations. Whenever he started forgetting, we'll stop taking his narrations. This person wasn't very manly. There's something called al-muru'ah. Muru'ah is this well-mannered, having a well-mannered, manly personality. Even a woman can narrate a hadith as being a well-mannered human being, a person who acts in a culturally acceptable way. So even if someone memorized like 10,000 hadith, but he walked around with like a pink jalabiya and like a hula hoop around his side, they wouldn't take a hadith from him because he's not a man, he's not well-mannered, and he's going against the culture. So how can we take narrations from him? Even if he had these 10,000 hadith, and even if people say, yes, he has great memorization, and he attended lessons with me, and he's a great person, they still wouldn't take it from him because they are preserving now. And it's not about supporting our movement, because if people, logically speaking, if I wanted to support a movement, if someone came to me with 10,000 hadith, I would say, yeah, I'll take them and I'll put them in a book and I'll say, this is Islam, and we have all these texts and sources, and I'll build upon that. But no, they weren't worried about that. They were worried about what the Prophet ﷺ said, which is the most authentic hadith known to date to man. One hadith that is most authentic in terms of its wording and its meaning, because you have something called tawatur lafzi and tawatur ma'nawi. Tawatur lafzi is that a hadith that so many narrators narrated with the same word, the same wording and the same meaning. Once you hit that level, and hundreds of narrators narrate the same hadith, it reaches a very, very strong level of authenticity. There are other tawatur which is also very strong, but the meanings are the same. The words can differ. So there's one hadith that Imam Muslim narrates, and others that reach this level of authenticity, where many Sahaba narrate the same wording and the same meaning. Men كذب علي متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. Whoever lies upon me intentionally, he shall let him reserve his place in hellfire. Can you imagine? So this was their qa'id, this was the main rule in their head, these scholars of hadith, when they were going through this preservation process. They weren't worried about supporting the movement of Islam. They were worried about preserving the words of the Prophet Muhammad. So when they did that, they put together a very strict, detailed system to purify these ahadith from that which is from that which is not from the Prophet. They made categories of authentic and good and weak and very weak and so on and so forth. It's a very long process. But the point is, all of this was to preserve the love, the wording and the meanings of what came to us from the Prophet ﷺ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, you don't have them here anymore. It was like all of a sudden, like they just, this huge rush of human beings just attacked, and they just had to make this system. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set them. And this is why I'm convinced of the opinion that says the word al-dhikra in the Quran, inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafizun. I'm convinced that it means the Quran and the Sunnah, because this system you can't find anywhere else in any other religion. It's not even normal to write volumes just criticizing the lives of people. They say that at this time, this person, his memory was bad. That's it. After this point, we can't take his hadith anymore. Imagine spending your life criticizing people to preserve the hadith of the Prophet and the miles and the months and days that they traveled to get one hadith, and sometimes they wouldn't even get the hadith because they didn't like the person, or because he didn't fit the standard for someone they could take from. Also, number 5, our religion is a system of daily implementation. This daily implementation is, in and of itself, preservation. If you think about it, you have to memorize Surah Al-Fatiha, and you have to pray 5 times a day, and you have to do certain things, and you have to abstain from certain things. Just abstaining from certain things and doing certain things is always going to remind you of the text, and always going to remind you of how you have to do things. It's always keeping you intact with the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay? Also, it's mandatory for a group of people to memorize the Quran. People have to memorize it. It has to be preserved. Not everyone has to memorize it, but people have to preserve it. That's part of Islam. There has to be certain people who are always memorizing the Quran. And again, there is no other book on earth where this many people memorize the same text in the same way without differing in opinion. Even if they differ in opinion within the roots of substantive law, they don't differ in opinion when it comes to the Quran. That's the text, that's the Quran. They differ in opinion when it comes to the meaning. So these are some of the ways Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserved our deen, preserved the text, and we're blessed to have this. And seriously, when you compare it to the other religions, we're spoiled. It's obvious, but we don't realize that. We don't really open up and study other religions and compare how they preserve and how we preserve. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the energy to keep implementing this deen so that we can be part of this preservation process. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي وحده على ومجد واسأل عونه وتوسلا. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على حبيبنا المصطفى وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So, what do we do that partially hurts this preservation? We know what we can do, but what do we do as Muslims? What do Muslims do today that hurts this preservation? Of course, it's going to stay preserved, but some people in certain areas hurt this preservation in a way where Islam is misrepresented and Islam is applied the wrong way. Number one, cultural rituals made into religious innovations through ignorance. This happens a lot. People get used to doing certain things that are praised culturally, and when no one tells them that this is not part of the deen, and they're praising it, and it's good, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with doing things culturally that are good, but once you make them religion and you say that you have to follow this because it's religious, that's when it becomes an innovation. So there are communities who live far away from knowledgeable people, who have certain cultural rituals that are praised, and these things just go down, and they pass them on, and their kids learn them until they almost become religious. Until they become religious, actually. And it's because it comes to the point where if they don't do them, it's a shame. And they've done something wrong. It's like they've sinned. So this is, of course, a direct effect of ignorance. It's the direct effect of being far away from the scholars, or the direct effect of just not asking. It could be near people have access to scholars and knowledge, but they don't ask. They just apply the way they want to apply, and they judge things accordingly. So, cultural rituals. Number two, constant sin leads to drifting. When you constantly sin, you drift, you start drifting, and you stop practicing as much. When you stop practicing as much, you're not as in tune with the text, and you're not as aware, and you start forgetting the Quran. And you have people, subhanAllah, you have Muslims that don't know how to make wudu properly, believe it or not. In Islamic countries, in Cairo, in Egypt, I've seen people who don't make wudu properly. You have Muslims who don't pray properly. They speak during salah still, and they think there's nothing wrong with it. So on and so forth. So the constant sitting, and of course ignorance, when you're not in close contact with your religion, and you practice sometimes on and off whenever there's a hurricane or whatever, you start forgetting. And this affects, if this passes on through your family, usually if you have a father and a mother who are very religious, sometimes the children take after them, and so on and so forth, and that hurts preservation partially. Number three, and lastly, spreading inaccurate Islamic information without doing proper research. All three of these go back to ignorance. But specifically speaking, spreading inaccurate Islamic information without doing proper research and without making sure. So it's upon us, if you want to be preservers of this deen, and to get that thawab and to feel that glory of preservation, if you want to be one of those people who are preserving Islam, make sure you are narrating or spreading proper, accurate information. For my conclusion, be proud to have something so pure and protected. Differences in opinion are not a sign of inaccuracy. They are a sign of mercy, because the differences in opinion are based upon the authentic text. And there are things that the Prophet ﷺ made vague, and so different scholars, according to their knowledge, are translating them according to what they learned from their scholars. So taking from any one of them, if you're convinced, is fine, as long as it was vague and it was taught to us in a vague manner from the Quran and the Sunnah. These differences are not inaccuracy. They're a mercy. Because imagine having only one opinion for everything, and people are in different situations, and sometimes they need different opinions. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet ﷺ left things vague for these types of situations. Believe it or not, sometimes you need to follow a certain madhab. You're in a certain situation where something is easier for you, and to follow that imam, and so on. Finally, you need to see how other religions preserve their religion, and see the process, or see the ways that they preserved. Through that, you can see how strong our system is, inshallah. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لكم. اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت، وعافنا فيمن عافيت، وتولنا فيمن توليت، وبارك لنا فيما أعطيت. قيل واصرف عنا برحمتك شر ما قضيت، إنك تقضي بالحق ولا يقضى عليك، إنه لا يذل من واليت ولا يعز من عاديت، تبارك ربنا وتعاليت، نستغفرك اللهم ونتوب إليك. اللهم اغفر للمسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات. اللهم آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار، وصلى وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم، والحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله.